Please welcome back Semafor business editor Liz Hoffman to lead an interview on AI investment.
Grant, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
AI in healthcare. I think it would be helpful to start with, what are we talking about? Most people, the first thing they do when they walk into a doctor's office is they fill out a piece of paper on a clipboard. So what are we really talking about here with that as a starting point?
It's always the same piece of paper.
Always the same piece of paper.
Yeah, so maybe I can, before we get into the specifics of the AI, there's sort of 3 or 4 key things that I think will be relevant for the what are we talking about. Number one, since COVID, the cost of hospital labor is up 37%. There are 10,000 seniors aging into Medicare a day. According to U.S. News and World Report, there will be a shortage by 2025 of 446,000 home health professionals, 30,000 nurse practitioners, and by 2030, 125,000 physicians. So part of what are we talking about is solving for a massive provider shortage problem that we have in the United States healthcare system.
Okay. So this isn't a question of just get more people through school,
right,
make the incentives, right, send them to med school, whatever. There's going to be a hole no matter what we do here.
Yeah, and that's really where I think AI can come in, because I think AI in healthcare, and we talked about it briefly when we were getting together, it's not just going to be this thing that has its own life and has no interaction with the healthcare system and is making these decisions on its own. What I think is going to be much more valuable is, given that provider shortage and given those cost changes, you can now use AI for really important things where it really works quite well. Like computer vision is amazing for radiology and what it can do in particular for breast cancer screenings and things like that. So the AI, what are we talking about, is using structured or unstructured data to make a recommendation to a physician so that they can then spend less time, which costs less money, getting to the right decision for the patient. And so that's really what I think we're going to create. It's not just going to be this one sort of monolithic AI that you're going to go through and it's going to spit out drugs that arrive at your house. I think it has to be inculcated into the provider experience so that the provider's making better decisions and they're able to do so more quickly using machine learning.
ChatGPT is wrong all the time, as we've found. And sometimes it's wrong in funny ways, but this is not an area where there's room for that kind of error. Though I'm curious what you make of this. And it's not funny, right? I think it's similar, when I think about it, to self-driving cars, which is humans driving cars kill humans all the time, but there's something psychologically really unsettling about it when it's a robot that does it. Doctors make mistakes all the time that cost people lives, but I suspect that there's less of a willingness to have the computer screw up.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, kind of, how do we bridge to the place where this is right often enough without getting totally turned off by the risks in the meantime?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, and the analogy to self-driving cars is a perfect one, because every time there's a car accident from Tesla's autopilot, it shows up on the internet, but every time a drunk driver hits somebody, doesn't even make the news. And so I think a big part of the way that we will get this to get the right level of engagement, the right adoption of the technology is, like I indicated earlier, it's going to be about the machine learning product making a recommendation to a provider. So one of the great examples is, if you're diagnosed with strep throat, there are 1 of 2 antibiotics that should be prescribed. The machine learning product can make a recommendation of which one it is, and then I think a physician needs to go in and verify that outcome so that the AI product is an arrow in their quiver to get you the right care more quickly than it is, to your point, a robot in a hospital that will give you a handful of pills and you just take them. And so I think the real opportunity is the integration into care delivery and true provider experience. And one of the examples we talked about as well was at Zephyr AI. We have that's
one of your portfolio companies.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and it's AI for precision medicine. So how do you get the right drug to the right person or the right patient at the right time? And we had a terminally ill young girl, and they'd tried virtually every known therapeutic that they could. They gave us a bunch of her genomic data, a bunch of information on her tumor type and this, that, and the other. And we were able to come back and make 7 recommendations for other therapies that should be considered in other forms of cancer that, based on her constituent parts of how her tumor was growing, could be really effective. And then now that team is taking those 7 recommendations and they'll go through their process of providing what's the right one. And I think that's a really good real world example of how AI can truly impact healthcare while managing that ethical side of the person being killed by an autopilot, car.
Let's talk about bias. We've seen systems that are way less important than healthcare get waylaid by the bias of the people programming them. For example, a bunch of smartphones for a while didn't do a very good job identifying people with dark skin. And given the racial and wealth outcomes, the inequality outcomes we've seen in healthcare already, how do you make sure that what's baked into whatever algorithms are doing the work doesn't make that worse?
Yeah, it's a great question as well. So I think writ large, machine learning will lower the overall barriers to entry for developing countries and for actually taking a real step forward in healthcare inequality globally. But to your point, if the regulatory body, the ethics infrastructure, if those things aren't co-created along with the technology and those biases are led to sort of come to fruition, then it actually will have the reciprocal effect where high per capita countries will be able to use AI-assisted infrastructure, but it's not going to be relevant in developing world. And so I think the way you solve it is you bring in, there's lots of amazing healthcare studies on disease and demographics, and for example, COVID elucidated huge differences in outcomes, both in fatality and worse disease for different racial profiles, different preconditions. And so I think that's an example where, in fact, there's a ton of data showing us how the unbiased part in healthcare really can affect decision making. So can you take that, effectively the part that's biased, to the positive? So if someone's more likely to develop X or Y, inculcating that into the technology, which again is kind of like the big headline that I think if I could have everyone take one line away, it'd be being front foot oriented on regulatory, ethics, and integration with the provider will be, I think, some of the 3 most important leading indicators for broad-based adoption of AI that will fundamentally change the cost of healthcare or the outcomes of healthcare, or both.
We're going to do one more very quick one. We've been saying here are the risks, but baked into that is the assumption that this stuff will work. And the last time that I think I heard as much optimism around sort of a sea change in healthcare was around mapping the human genome. And it really hasn't worked. Right. It hasn't fundamentally changed how most health conditions are treated. What if we're wrong here?
Yeah, so great question. I actually think, ironically, they're related. So the good news is, since we mapped the human genome, the cost of a genomic or epigenetic test is dropping about two times faster than Moore's law. So part of why the human genome mapping didn't have the breakthrough that everyone was hoping, it was so expensive it was inaccessible to be used at scale into people's care. That's now changed. And I think because that's changed, and now you have an AI that can be built off of someone's genomic information to make recommendations, and then you're adding genomics information, behavioral information, environmental information, you put those 3 things together, that gets back to bringing the science into healthcare, which most people don't realize. The provider relationship with a physician and patient, it's still a lot more art than science. So I think the optimism is connecting all those parts so that you can make a better decision. And ultimately, unlike the human genome, we're not just mapping something. We're going to say, well, you're at risk for this disease, and here's the 3 things we can do as a result. So I think AI is fundamentally more actionable than the process of just mapping the human genome.
All right. We're going to make medicine a science eventually. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
All good?